this video we will learn about OOP, especially in JavaScript, so how it's different from the more traditional OOP and also different ways of implementing this paradigm in JavaScript. In the last video we talked about the classic object-oriented programming model with the classes and instances created from these classes. A class is like a blueprint which is a theoretical plan and that we use to build many houses in the real world. In the same way, theoretical class can be used to create actual objects which are called instances. And we can then use in our code, and this process of creating an instance is called instantiation. Now earlier I said that in JavaScript things works a bit differently. So why did I first tell you about classes and instances? Well, and it's because we do have similar concepts in JavaScript. So it's very useful to first understand the class instances model, plus many people also just use this terminology in the context of JavaScript. And finally, JavaScript syntax it's use also some of these terms, for example instances. And so you really need to know what a class is and what an instance is. Now anyway, how does OOP actually work in JavaScript? Where in JavaScript we have something called prototype, and all objects in JavaScript are linked to a certain prototype object. So we can say that each object has a prototype, and now he's come to the major. So prototype objects contain methods and properties that all the objects that are linked to that prototype can access and use. And this behavior is usually called prototype inheritance. So again, prototype inheritance means that all objects that are linked to a certain prototype object can use the methods and properties that are defined on that prototype. So basically, object inherit methods and properties from the prototype, which is the reason why this mechanism is called prototype inheritance. Just note that this inheritance is usually different from the inheritance that we talked about in the last video. So that was one class inherited from another class, but this case it's basically an instant inherited from a class. So that is very different. So now we can also say that object delegate behavior to the linked prototype object. And behavior is just another term for methods here. So besides prototype inheritance, we also call this mechanism delegation. And that's also the reason why this arrow is pointing to prototype, because technically objects delegate their behavior to the prototypes. On the other hand, in classic and OOP with the classes, the behavior, so the methods are actually copied from the class to the object. So that is completely different. But anyway, we have actually already seen this mechanism in action many times before, but without knowing that it was happening. For example, each time that we use an array method like map, we are able to use that method because of prototype inheritance. So when you go to MDN to check the documentations for any array method, what you will see there is that it's actually called array.prototype.map. Why is that relevant? So what does that mean? Well, array.prototype is the prototype objects or all the array that we create in JavaScript. So just like this example array called num here, now this prototype object contains all the array methods including map. So this is where they are actually defined. So since the array.prototype is the prototype of the num array, it means that num is a link to that prototype, and therefore it has access to all the methods that are defined on the array.prototype object, just like a map method. So and since our array inherit the map method, or again we can also say that array delegate the behavior of mapping to its prototype. So you can choose whatever make more sense in your mind. But what matter is that map method is actually not defined on the num array itself, but on its prototype. And of course we're gonna check out this behavior also in our code and practice. So how do we actually create prototypes? How do we link objects to prototypes? And how can we create new objects without having classes from which we can instantiate objects? So in summary, this question is how do we implement object-oriented programming in JavaScript and practice? Well, in JavaScript, there are actually three different ways of doing all this: the constructor function technique, ESS classes, and also object.create function. So first, construction functions are a way of creating objects programmatically using a function which we also set a new object prototype. And this is actually how building objects like arrays or maps or sets are implemented. And also, this is how OOP has been done in JavaScript, basically since the beginning. Next, the ES6 release introduced classes into JavaScript. And so now, ES6 classes are actually a more modern way of doing OOP in JavaScript. However, keep in mind that these are actually not the kind of classes that we talked about in the last video. They are instead just so-called synthetic sugar over constructor function. So this means that ESC classes are basically just a layer of abstractions over construction functions. So it's really just a nicer syntax that make it easier for newcomer to do in OOP and JavaScript. But behind the scene, ESC classes are actually implemented with the construction function. And they are also used prototype inheritance just like we learned in the last slide. Finally, there is also object.create functions, which is basically the easiest and most straightforward way of linking an object to a prototype object. However, it is not as used as the other two methods. Now to finish, one important thing to keep in mind is the four principles of oriented programming that we learned in the last video. So that's abstraction, encapsulation, inheritance, and polymorphism are still valid and important with the prototype inheritance.